Good morning. Happy Mother's Day. As today's Mother's Day, I thought I would take the opportunity to speak of some strong women of faith represented in the New Testament. Initially, I had considered some of the female characters in the Old Testament, like Miriam or Esther or Hannah, but I felt that perhaps I should investigate the group of women in the New Testament we seldom hear about, the female disciples, apostles, or followers of Jesus. These women are mentioned in the Gospels and letters to the churches, but don't really receive much treatment in Sunday sermons, except perhaps in relation to Jesus' birth and death, which are like circumstances where women traditionally take on caregiving roles. So today, we're going to look at a few of the women who would be considered the first female disciples or apostles of the Christian movement. We will discover who they were, how they came to know Jesus, and most importantly, how Jesus interacted with them. First, it's important to note the role of women in society at the time of the early church. In general, the cultures of the Middle East and Europe, that of Palestine, Greece, Rome, and Macedonia, were overwhelmingly patriarchal. However, some women had more freedom and rights than others. The women in Palestine and Greece had the least amount of freedom, and their worlds permitted no more than being a wife and a mother. Only Greek priestesses had any real power outside the home. In Rome, women had more power, and although they could not hold office, they were certainly the influencers behind many men that held office. Even Roman female slaves had more rights than Greek free women. Macedonian women had the most freedom of all, including holding office and sitting on the throne. So this is the culture into which Jesus was born, the culture in which he speaks and invites many to follow him. Are you ready? So let's meet some of these women who make the decision to follow Jesus. Reading from Luke 10:38-42. As Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him in her home. Her sister Mary sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he taught. But Martha was distracted by the big dinner she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, "Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me." But the Lord said to her, "My dear Martha, you are worried and upset over all the details. There is only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it, and it will not be taken away from her." So here we meet Martha and Mary. And next to Jesus' mother, Mary, perhaps these two women are the most prominent in Jesus' life. Jesus visits these sisters and their brother Lazarus many times in his life. Martha is the older sister and the mistress of the house, for she is the one to open her house to Jesus. It's she who takes charge of preparing for the guests, and we learn that she feels her sister should help out in this role. And although the story focuses on the one thing Martha must learn, the supreme responsibility of hearing God's word and being Jesus' disciple, Mary appears to have already figured this out. When the text says, "Mary sat at his feet," scholars have discovered what this turn of phrase actually means is to be a disciple of, which means Luke is intimating that Mary is a disciple of Jesus, and as such, her behavior is to be emulated. In Jewish culture, women were only allowed to attend synagogue, learn, and become scholars themselves if their husbands, or in the case of female slaves, if their masters were rabbis. However, for a rabbi like Jesus to come into a woman's home and teach her specifically, it was unheard of, or at least it was not written about in any historical documents we have. Even Jesus being alone with the two women in their home was considered questionable behavior for a Jewish rabbi. Both the role Mary assumes and the role of Jesus go counterculture to the role of a Jewish man and woman. There goes Jesus, breaking the rules again. In contrast to Mary, Martha takes on the more traditional role of a woman in hospitality and serving Jesus. However, when she accuses Jesus of not caring about her heavy workload and indirectly accuses Mary of not helping, Jesus does not attempt to devalue her efforts, nor does he attack the traditional role of women. He does, however, defend Mary's right to learn from him and comments that learning from him is the crucial thing for those who wish to serve him. Jesus' comment doesn't mean we should abandon everyday life activities like hospitality and meal preparation, caring for our homes and our families, going to work to support our families so we can sit around all day and contemplate the things of the Lord. That's not possible. That's not practical. His comment is about knowing what is most important and what pleases God. Martha had in her home the giver of life, the teacher who could save her soul, but she didn't recognize him as this. She was consumed with her service to him, and this was to her own detriment. She did not see who was standing in front of her. We are all of us distracted like Martha with the things of life and the service we give to many aspects of our lives. Service to family, service to our work, to the charities we belong to, the friends who need us, our church, our community. Jesus' words here remind us life is a balance of competing priorities. Ben Witherington III, in his book Women and the Genesis of Christianity, says this: Jesus did not come to be served, but to serve. He's the host, and Mary and Martha are the guests. Mary has just received from Jesus, and this is something the author intimates Mary chooses for herself. That is, responding to the word of faith by placing it first. Martha's service is not denigrated, but it does not come first. One must reorient one's lifestyle according to what Jesus says is the higher priority. In John 11:17-29, we meet these two sisters again, this time under painful circumstances. Their brother Lazarus has died, and they are mourning his death. When Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if only you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus told her, "Your brother will rise again." "Yes," Martha said, "he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day." Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die." "Do you believe this, Martha?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I have always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God." Then she returned to Mary. She called Mary aside from the mourners and told her, "The teacher is here and wants to see you." So Mary immediately went to him. In this account of Jesus' interaction with Martha and Mary, we see the focus once again on Martha. She's still discovering who Jesus is, and although she does not yet recognize him as the giver of life itself, she is certainly on her way to finding faith in Jesus. In fact, her confession of belief in Jesus is the fullest expression of faith given by any disciple, male or female, until this point. Even fuller than Peter's famous confession to Jesus in Matthew 16, verse 16, where he says, "Then Jesus asked the disciples, 'But who do you say I am?' Simon Peter answered, 'You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God.' Jesus replied, 'You are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you.'" And so we note that Martha's confession is even greater than this confession of Simon Peter. John is keen to show his audience that women have a right to be taught even the mysteries of faith, and that they are capable of responding to faith with an accurate confession. In short, they are capable of being fully fledged disciples of Jesus. Let's move on to meet a few more women in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8. To set the stage, Jesus is fully immersed in his ministry now, and he's traveling to various towns with the disciples, teaching as he goes. He's been performing miracles, including raising a woman's son from the dead, and more recently was anointed with oil by a woman with a sordid past. In chapter 8, he continues teaching and healing as he goes. The first 3 verses set the stage for his travels. Soon afterward, Jesus began a tour of the nearby towns and villages, preaching and announcing the good news about the kingdom of God. He took his 12 disciples with him, along with some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Among them were Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's business manager, Susanna, and many other disciples who were contributing from their own resources to support Jesus and his disciples. So here we meet 3 prominent women in Jesus' life and ministry of the gospel. Mary Magdalene, certainly one of the most famous women in the Bible for reasons we won't get into today, and Joanna and Susan, both wealthy women who are compelled to follow Jesus. Mary Magdalene, or Mary of Magdala, was a Jewish Christian who came to follow Jesus because he cast 7 demons out of her. I guess I would follow after that too, wouldn't you? She was witness to his crucifixion and resurrection and is the first person to see Jesus after his resurrection. Within the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, she is named at least 12 times, which is more than most of the apostles. Joanna was healed by Jesus and later supported him and his disciples in their travels, was also a witness to Jesus' resurrection. And we see in the passage she is named as the wife of Chuza, who managed the household of Herod Antipas, the king of Galilee, which means she would have been wealthy and powerful in the community. Susanna likewise is named as financially supporting the ministry of Jesus, so must have also come from wealth. But we have little detail about her recorded. So here Luke gives evidence of how the gospel message breaks down class and economic divisions, as well as social barriers, and reconciles men and women from all walks of life into one community. It would have been really unusual for women of Susanna and Joanna's status to mingle with lowly fishermen like many of the disciples. Furthermore, Jewish, Greek, and Roman cultures subjected women to a deep-rooted tradition that kept women inside the home. The home was the woman's sphere, and that was where all her activity should take place. But the fact that these women traveled from village to village as part of Jesus' entourage is really quite remarkable. It was unheard of in these times and considered scandalous in the Jewish circles. Witherington notes, Luke intends for us to understand that these women were only the most prominent among many other women that followed Jesus. There were many more unnamed women following and supporting Jesus and the 12. Luke indicates that because of the way Jesus intervened in the lives of these women, they felt free to both serve him and the 12 from their own means. And although it was uncommon for women to travel with a rabbi, it was not uncommon for women to support rabbis and their disciples out of their own pockets. What is unique about the actions of Jesus' female followers is that the traditional roles of hospitality and service are seen by them as a way to serve not only their physical families, but also the family of faith. Being Jesus' disciple didn't lead women to abandon their traditional roles, but gave these roles new significance and importance. The transformation of these women involved not only assuming new discipleship roles, but also resuming their traditional roles for a new purpose. So the female disciples would not only be learning from Jesus and spreading the word, they would also have helped to feed and care for the traveling group, just like the male disciples were doing. The Apostle Paul also refers specifically to several female disciples in his writings, including Phoebe, whom he names as a deacon and as a helper or patron of many. In the book of Romans, we find Paul has sent her to deliver a letter to the Roman church. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who is a deacon in the church of Cenchrea. Welcome her in the Lord as one who is worthy of honor among God's people. Help her in whatever she needs, for she's been helpful to many, and especially to me. Romans 16, verses 1 through 5. Actually, it's 1 and 2. And Priscilla and Aquila, of whom Paul writes in Romans 16, give my greetings to Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in the ministry of Jesus Christ. In fact, they once risked their lives for me. I am thankful to them, and so are the Gentile churches. Also give my greetings to the church that meets in their home. Romans 16, 3 through 5. In Acts 18, we learn that Paul met Priscilla and her husband Aquila in Corinth. They are Jews who have just moved from Italy and have the same tent-making profession as Paul. Priscilla and Aquila are first-century Christian missionary married couple, mentioned many times in the New Testament and traditionally listed among the 70 disciples. They lived, worked, and traveled with Paul. Priscilla and Aquila are described as providing a presence that strengthened the early Christian churches. Paul was generous in his recognition and acknowledgement of his indebtedness to them. Together, they are credited with instructing Apollos, a major evangelist of the first century, and explaining to him the way of God more accurately. The last female disciple I wanted to mention is a Macedonian woman. In Acts 16, 9 through 11, we are told, that night Paul had a vision. A man from Macedonia in northern Greece was standing there pleading with him, come over to Macedonia and help us. So we decided to leave for Macedonia at once, having concluded that God was calling us to preach the good news there. We boarded a boat at Troas and sailed straight across to the island of Samothrace. And the next day we landed at Neapolis. From there we reached Philippi, a major city of that district of Macedonia and a Roman colony, and we stayed there for several days. On the Sabbath, we went a little way outside the city to a riverbank where we thought people would be meeting for prayer, and we sat down to speak with some women who had gathered there. One of them was Lydia from Thyatira, a merchant of expensive purple cloth who worshiped God. As she listened to us, the Lord opened her heart, and she accepted what Paul was saying. She and her household were baptized, and she asked us to be her guests. If you agree that I am a true believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my home. And she urged us until we agreed. So Lydia of Thyatira is regarded as the first documented convert to Christianity in Europe. She was a well-to-do agent of a purple dye firm in Thyatira, Acts 16:40, 17 through 1. Thyatira is the province of Lydia, from where the apostle derives her name. It's located in what is now Western Turkey and was famous for the red variety of purple dye. Lydia of Thyatira is known as a seller or a merchant of purple cloth. Thank you. Very nice hug. Women in Macedonia, unlike women in Jewish and Greek cultures, had a lot more freedom and influence, even more than Roman women. We see Paul is willing to begin a church in Macedonia with a group of female converts and Lydia at its helm. And we see in Luke's gospel that Lydia's significance is not confined to her being only a disciple or only a hostess to the traveling disciples. He wishes us to know that what began as a lodging for missionaries became the birthplace of the church at Philippi. Here we see how a woman's role of providing hospitality played an integral part in the establishment and continuance of a local church. As 21st century Canadians, the radical way Jesus treated women and invited them to learn alongside his male disciples is somewhat lost on us. We believe in equality of the sexes. We see women as more than just an extension of a man, more than only a wife and or a mother. We believe that women are as important to our culture as men. Jesus' radical views of the worth and ability of women allowed his female followers to find freedom in his teaching. Jesus' teaching emancipated the women of Rome, of Greece, Macedonia, and Palestine. He looked beyond the culture of the day and saw hearts open to hearing his words. He made himself accessible to all people. However, as with many institutions, the church, as it grew and established itself, allowed the culture of the day to dictate how it behaved and organized itself, and thus it began to find itself at odds with the examples of Jesus. Not all churches, but many. We see illustrations of this in the letters Paul writes to the baby churches that sprang up throughout the empire, many struggling with infighting, inequality, battles over leadership, selfishness and suppression, exclusion of the widows, following the teachings of one apostle over the other. Well, we follow John's gospel. Well, we follow Peter's gospel. But this is not what Jesus taught, nor what he wanted for his people. Jesus was a radical rabbi compared to his Jewish contemporaries. We do not find negative remarks about the nature or the abilities or religious potential of women compared to men on the lips of Jesus, in contrast to various Jewish authors. Women played as much of a role in the spread of the gospel and growth of the early church as men did. And the same is true today. Women are integral to the teaching of the word through a variety of means. I looked to my grandmother as my spiritual mentor for most of my formative years. And although I did not agree with everything she said and everything she taught me, she did impress upon me how much God loved me, and above all, that it was my duty to know him more deeply. She was a marvelous listener. My mother instilled in me a sense that, as a woman, I have every much as right to influence others for Christ as a man does. We as women bring different attributes of Christ to the world, much needed attributes, not more important than the attributes of men, nor less important. Ultimately, God is calling all of us, and his Spirit will move through whomever is willing. May we be the strong, vulnerable, approachable women Jesus intends us to be, desperate to know him more, passionate to share him with this world. May we all, male and female, seek to place ourselves at the feet of Jesus, learning from him how to face our world, how to love our world, how to invite our world into dialogue with him. I trust this look at the female disciples of the early church has both inspired and challenged you on this Mother's Day 2017. Amen.